I always loved games that lived within universes. I'm talking about the games in Yu-Gi-Oh!, Gwent in The Witcher, and of course, Quidditch in Harry Potter. So imagine my glee as a child getting my hands on the Harry Potter Quidditch board game. I was ready to shoot some quaffles, bash some bludgers, and snag some snitches. And seeing this elaborate looking catapult as soon as you open the box is enough to get any young Witcher wizard excited. However, I soon realized the Harry Potter Quidditch board game is one of the worst board games ever. Each team has their 7 players, and there are also 2 standees for the bludgers. They don't look too bad, to be honest. I like that they each have their house crest at the bottom and the plastic stands are colored red and green. And the designers clearly took some shortcuts. For one, they didn't incorporate all the players from Harry's first year, where Gryffindor's chasers were girls. All the players here are boys. That was when I realized every player's sketch is just recolored for its Slytherin counterpart. Slytherin's chasers were all boys, so I guess the publisher didn't want to pay double for unique illustrations of each player. I understand that, but it would have been nice to see Angelina Johnson or Katie Bell on here. The only exception to this is obviously Harry. That'd be weird if Slytherin's Seeker also happened to have a lightning bolt scar on their forehead. Although what they actually did for Slytherin's Seeker is a small, silly detail I didn't notice until I was about to review this game. He looks completely normal at first, then you compare him to Slytherin's Chaser 1 piece, and you realize they literally erased the quaffle and rotated him 45 degrees to repurpose him as a Seeker. I also want to point out how weirdly thick these figures are, especially compared to the size of the board spaces. There were a few times in my playthroughs where one of us knocked over a piece while trying to move another. However, that's mainly the fault of the board spaces. And speaking of the board spaces, each space is hexagonal. You set up the game by shuffling up tiles and dispersing them face down across the board. And this is ridiculously frustrating. Each of these tiles is small and has the thickness of a dime. And there are 100 of them. Eventually you get tired of, dare I say, shuffling them, and resort to throwing them out face down. The next thing I hate about these small tiles, they're square, and you're dealing them out on a board with hexagonal spaces. Who thought this was a good idea? Each team's players start on these 7 spaces of their own end. Then you stick these golden hoops at each end of the board, and after a tedious setup, you're finally ready to play. Sadly, the game doesn't get much better from here. Each turn, you roll 1 die and can move any or all of your players up to the result on the die. The first 2 times someone rolls a 1, they place a bludger on the board next to one of their beaters, who controls that bludger every turn until one of the opponent's beaters lands next to it. But before that happens, they roll and move it right after each of their opponent's turns and knock out every piece it passes through for 2 turns. That's all beaters are used for actually, and they don't affect the game too much even if you do manage to knock out a chaser or 2. Beaters can't interact with the main components. They're for the chasers and seekers. If a chaser or seeker ends their movement on a space with a tile, you flip over that tile and carry out its special effect. Flipping over these tiles and discovering what lies beneath should be fun and exciting. If only the tiles weren't so oppressive. Of the 100 tiles, 15 of them are slow potions, which means that piece can't move on the player's next turn. Another 15 tiles are the penalty, which removes the piece for 1 turn and returns them back to one of those starting spaces. Then, almost a third of the tiles have the Hogwarts crest on them, which do absolutely nothing. So of all the tiles you can flip over, more than half of them don't even come with a positive effect. As you uncover these tiles, the pitch feels less like a realm of broom-flying fun, and more like a field of landmines. One of the tiles you do want to see is the quaffle. Should a seeker flip it over, it stays face up on the board. But if a chaser lands on it, they can take the quaffle if another chaser isn't already holding it. To show possession, you take a peel-off quaffle sticker and stick it on the chaser. Now on a future turn, this chaser can forego their movement and instead take a shot. You can crack open plenty of board games and see dice, playing pieces, and tiles, but you never see a miniature catapult. This cool feature should be the coolest part of the game, but they still find a way to mess it up. It makes sense if you took the shot from right where your chaser is hovering. That way, getting close enough to the hoops can make for a shot that with a little practice is slightly trickier than a layup. But fitting this giant catapult directly on the board isn't doable with a bunch of standees in the way. So what the game has you do is place the catapult off the edge of the board, aligned with where your chaser is. So instead of head-on shots at the hoop, you're on this awkward angle every time you're trying to shoot. And I haven't even begun to talk about the clunkiness of the catapult. This thing launches balls. You barely need to pull it back at all to shoot across the board, but we all have that one friend who we know will pull the catapult all the way back with the sole intent of shooting the ball into the stratosphere. That's not to mention this launcher isn't a slingshot that fires a straight bullet. Rather, it's an arced trajectory and a horizontal target. So you're not really aiming at a hoop, you're doing legit rocket science here, trying to get just the right touch on the catapult, so when the ball begins its downward motion, there's a chance it'll slide through a tiny crevice of hoop. Oh yeah, and the keeper? They can only patrol these 7 starting spaces, and their only use is you can't score through the hoop they're closest to, which is also ambiguous because what about this space right here? You could argue it's closest to both of these hoops. I shouldn't even be surprised at this point they didn't bother to color code these spaces or have any way to denote what's closest to what hoop. The real keeper here is whoever stands behind the table to try and stop the ball from rolling under the floor and getting lost. It's the only time you feel like you're actually playing Quidditch and was honestly the most fun part of the game for me. At least until I would miss the ball and we'd spend the next 10 minutes fishing it out from underneath the couch. So after all this, avoiding the penalty in slow potion tokens, getting close to the hoop, and somehow landing an improbable catapult shot, you'll think you made a dent scoring your 10 points. But it doesn't even matter. If you're familiar with how Quidditch works in the wizarding world, you probably know where I'm going with this. It's an unfair sport primarily because of the golden snitch. One of the 100 tiles in this game is this elusive trinket, and if a chaser lands on it, it stays face up until a seeker lands on it. And when they do, the game is over, and that team gets 150 points. There are only 20 quaffle tiles in the game, so unless you miraculously happen to get 15 of them, and the awkward shooting mechanics don't hinder you from making all 15 of them, then everything regarding chasers, quaffles, keepers, and hoops is irrelevant, and the game boils down to a race to see who can flip over the winning tile first. Now, I know Book 3 hints that Hogwarts' Quidditch scoring table isn't a simple win-loss format, rather an overall point differential system, so the chaser's hard work isn't for nothing. Of course, this doesn't translate well to a board game you'll play once, despise, and never pick up again. I get the children this game is marketed to won't really care about the lack of competitive fairness, but the numerous issues of this game will not be enough to hold their attention, which lands the Harry Potter Quidditch board game in board game purgatory.